Welcome, everyone, to the Vein and Lymphatic University. I'm Michael Sadek, practicing vascular surgeon in New York, and today we have Jeff Elkins, truly a pioneer in the biomedical space. So thank you for being here and welcome.
Oh, thank you.
So please indulge me first with this introduction because you've kind of accomplished so much already, and I think it's important for folks to know your background so that when you have so that when they take any of your advice, they know that it's coming from a real level of experience. So Jeff Elkins is an engineer from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is currently CEO of Intervene, a San Francisco Bay Area startup focused on interventions for deep vein disease, initially on reflux via the blue leaf endovenous valve formation system, and now focused on the Cronus, a new tech targeting chronic venous in-stent restenosis and native vein chronic obstruction and occlusion. And I think we can kind of touch on that perhaps towards the end of this discussion. He was previously CEO of Veniti, which was a first-generation dedicated venous stent acquired by Boston Scientific. But it hasn't just all been venous. Prior to his work in venous, he was CEO, then COO for Aptus, which was a second-generation EVAR-TVAR startup, which developed a novel endo anchors used for fixation. I think many folks in the aortic space are familiar with this. And while the endograft itself was not commercialized, Aptus brought the anchoring technology to market, and the company was acquired by Medtronic, who further expanded its use. He was also CTO and CEO of Flowmedica. So not just the aortic space, this is a renal drug delivery catheter for renal injury and acute renal failure, which was acquired by AngioDynamics. Still additional experience with EVAR and TVAR as CTO, responsible for research and development and the clinical study of the Talent endograft family, which was also acquired by Medtronic. And he relocated to California for Medtronic as the new aortic division's first VP and business unit manager, where they combined design features of Talent and Anurex into a Gen 2 concept that formed the basis of the Medtronic Endurant and Valiant. Early in his career, Jeff worked in manufacturing and R&D on coronary and neurointerventional devices at Cordis, as well as operations, management, and Haemonetics Corp. So literally head to toe, arteries and veins. A privilege to have you here.
No problem, thanks.
So I guess, maybe something that's of direct interest to folks at the Vein and Lymphatic University is the vein space and deep vein reflux, or DVR. I know you've had a tremendous interest in this, particularly with the blue leaf. So maybe just some preliminary thoughts on that, and then we can go with some offshoots.
So overall, I was introduced to DVR through Vanity and the work on obstruction and occlusion. And we were lucky enough to work under Peter Neglin. Dr. Neglin and Dr. Raju had worked with the company very, very early. Peter, when he retired, he got heavily involved with us. So a lot of teaching by one of the masters, one of the pioneers. And as we got into the world of obstruction, realizing everything was all about hypertension, venous hypertension, and the effects of outflow obstruction, gravity and reflux, in this case deep reflux, became completely related. And as we moved more and more towards the post-thrombotic population, and I'll say with you and Mr. Black and David Dexter and Paul Gagne, Patty Thorpe, as we started seeing more and more of the difficult patients, I started noticing DVR and obstruction. They were, often in the same patient. And, obviously papers went on. Dr. O'Donnell's group and Susan Kahn and others have talked about how often the comorbidities are DVR, including superficial as well, and obstruction. And I think from that early work with stents, I just became aware of deep vein reflux, and all at the same time was meeting the original founder, Fletcher Wilson, the original founder of the company here. And it just seemed like a natural transition after venous stenting. And having said that, the venous field was, I thought, ripe. It was a little earlier, a few years ago, but a lot of physicians who had been waving the flag for years, Lowell Kabnick and Dr. Komaroda and Dr. Neglin and Raju and others, all of a sudden this came into a very obvious and popular thing. And it just made, to me, natural sense to continue on in veins. Having made good relationships, started to understand the etiology and the pathology. To me, it just made sense. And the holy grail, the final frontier of deep vein reflux was a good challenge. And I thought, it was just getting bubbling up with Hancock Jaffe as well as Cook. Why not take a shot? And
Wow.
yeah, it's been a good technical challenge for sure.
Yeah, no, I mean it's clearly amazing. I think the most striking thing about how you describe everything is how much you delve into the biology and the clinical aspects of it and your grasp of it. And you're coming from an engineering background, a business background. It's amazing. How important is it to know what you're dealing with to bring a device to market? I mean, you've really gone in depth. So, I mean, what advice do you have to perhaps other folks in a similar position or in an aspiring position to get a handle on this? Because you really have mentioned nothing about finances, about funding. You've really focused on the root of the matter, the pathophysiology and what we're dealing with. Is that your approach in general? What's your advice
Yeah, and
relating to that?
I would say it's been my approach since early aortic, which is complete immersion in what you're into. Complete immersion means scientific literature, being in the scientific sessions, understanding who the pioneers are, the lead authors, the society guidance, those medical society leaders in leadership. I think it's hugely important as a strategic advantage. And if you're out, let's say, pitching for money or pitching with a corporation to partner, I think it's everything about establishing credibility and understanding, yeah, the disease, the stats, the background, who May and Thurner were, et cetera, et cetera. And I think ultimately it's about establishing credibility so that your eventual pitch is taken seriously, but I don't think you could design something or design a trial or stats or endpoints if you didn't know the basics. So for me, I did watch a few mentors get immersed, absolutely immersed. I saw how well it went for them, and and really, whether it's around the dinner table with you or Dr. Gagne or whoever, you pick up even more. So yeah, it's just something that I've found an absolute necessity and an advantage. And I'll also say I also fill what I'm weak at with something I can do like that. So I may not be the person who can do a waterfall diagram on what a common shareholder can earn, but yeah, I'm comfortable with the data.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I mean, you clearly there's some, you know, proof in the pudding, if you will. You've brought a lot of things to market. What do you think are some of the common traits of the successful ventures or endeavors that you've been involved in?
Yeah, I would say one is not being afraid of emerging markets.
Yeah,
I've never been involved with anything established. So these were emerging, and I kind of, I'll say something Jack Welch had once written about seeing around corners. And if you're in those meetings, and if you're in the literature and at the dinner table, more than just social matters, you do see a few things as they come along on the horizon. And so for me, it was don't be afraid of getting into something that doesn't exist. And I will also say that I think the venues, and let's just say in our world of vascular, the venues from the VEITH meeting to Viva and SVS VAM and SIR and all the particular venues, and then the journals and the societies, and this includes the Europeans, Charing Cross as well. The venues make perfect market development vehicles, if you will. And whether it's the formula of submitting your material for presentation, it's the scientific advisory meetings at the watching the competition and seeing what they offer and being in those sessions. I think the formula for emerging things in vascular We are well set up. The societies do a very good job with it. The literature, the way that we get approvals and submissions accepted. Um, I don't mean to say it's formulaic and you just do this, but the mechanisms really exist to get information out there, to get it utilized, to get clinical trials. And now, for example, we know where sites enroll. We know who are quality and compliant. So I think the formula in vascular has made it particularly interesting. And that I and do mean that includes the vascular surgeons, interventional radiologists, peripheral cardiologists. But yeah, we're really blessed with what we've got to be able to do some of these emerging markets. And
Yeah,
the
no,
docs we work with understand research.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd like to echo all of that and hopefully take some of your advice, from my standpoint as well. Um, Now, so trying to focus a little bit onto DVR. I mean, you've been thoroughly um, entrenched in the space and you've got a tremendous amount of insight. Where do you see it going? And specifically, the challenges that need to be overcome and the potential hope or for
Yep.
future potential, if you will.
So DVR, it's been referred to as the Holy Grail, the sort of the final frontier. I mentioned it earlier, and it's had years of failure. Trucks in the ditch.
Mhm.
The amount of companies that have tried. Cook, I think, has been the longest at this, based on is it Pavchik's work, and the amount of trucks in the ditch are incredible. But that was the case in EVAR and other things. Carotid, we know. So I think it's very, very difficult to solve. Huge problem that affects millions and millions of patients. And of course, today they've got nothing more than compression stockings and basic leg elevation and palliative care until some of these interventions came along. Um, I will say we were not successful with it. We completed 41 cases and had difficulty tying hemodynamics to good valve quality or good symptom improvement, whether that be PCSS, ulcer healing, pain scores, etc. Having said that, I think Hancock-Jaffe or Invino is moving along well, and the recent data shows. I think they've met their major adverse event rates. In fact, just a couple of days ago, the data came out, and
Mhm.
they'll present. But it's slower than we hoped, and I think that ultimately, in working with the FDA, there's an interest in both clinical improvement as well as mechanistic evidence.
Mhm.
Our difficulty has been mechanistic evidence. And
Right.
so we, making autologous valves, are focused on direct imaging, direct valve visualization, which is difficult. So partly because of financials, the difficulty with financials and keeping up with, in this case, very expensive studies, the little startup in a tough environment wasn't able to finance that. So I think others, Cook, Invino, et cetera, may have a shot, but it's more of an academic project than it is for, I think, a small startup.
I see. So it seems like we potentially have to get down to fundamentals again.
Yep.
It's tough to prove that a device works if you can't measure the outcomes. And if you're even having trouble measuring a baseline or even knowing what the baseline is, I mean, what are your thoughts with
Yep.
that? I mean, are we chasing, is DVR even a real thing? Should we be trying to fix it?
It's a really good question, and I will say
Yeah.
it's semi-complicated. I'll go all the way back to Raju and Neglin, and I think
Mhm.
around 2004, they identified, for example, reflex time was a better qualitative measurement than a quantitative measurement, and they had highlighted, for example, velocity and volume may be better indicators. However, it's not universally accepted, and our data wasn't uh, correlatable, if you will. Having said that, I think Hancock Jaffe, they did something that we couldn't, and they ended up doing more sonography, more mapping, more screening. We ended up, we had more difficulty with that. We both firms ended up sending their own teams of sonographers to try to get more uniform data. Um, but for us, it became cost prohibitive. It really did.
Mm.
I do think this will ultimately work in the end. and I think it's worth it in the end. However, when you look at, I think of VEITH 2 years ago, Dr. Laurie had presented a presentation where he showed you could have popliteal reflux even with competent valves. And then Dr. Lugli, she showed all the way going back to the neovalve work, same session, you will always have popliteal reflux. And again, even with their good neovalve. So then we started wondering, will there be clinical benefit? If you've got gravity still causing hypertension down at the ulcer bed, will there be ultimately clinical benefit and healing? I do think there will. I think it's just a matter of cracking the code, and it's a matter of tenacity and persistence. But I do think it will get there, and it may need nuances, specifically more screening to rule out X reflux pattern that pre-exists. But I think they'll get there. And ultimately, yeah, it's worth it because there are so many patients affected, and the issue is so debilitating.
Right, right.
But yeah, I think we're on the verge of more discovery. It's normal funding, financials, NIH money, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But someone will get there.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest challenges from your perspective in terms of funding and financials,
So
especially in
the
the current
environment,
market? You've alluded to that a couple of times already.
yeah, it's been as far as the venture community, it's been as bad as it's ever been. And I remember going back to the 2008, 2009 period, it was terrible. This is said to be worse. And with some
You
of
say
the,
that with a smile. It's funny.
uh, it doesn't slow you down. I mean, it is what it
Yeah,
is. And just
yeah,
because it's difficult, it is what it is. But it just says, I think, try a little harder. Um, but yeah, the environment, and this probably goes back to the pandemic and certainly the Silicon Valley Bank issues and then what followed. But investors are holding on to money. They're holding on and reserving their cash for current investments. And yeah, the various reports that come out from the pitch book and other places that measure this, it's been the lowest of the low in terms of number of venture firms active, the amount of deals, the amount of money in the deals. So it's been massive flat rounds and down rounds and refinancing. But I think good ideas will still be funded. And my particular focus has been on the corporate partners as well. And in this particular Venus world, it's an amazing list of 9 to 11 strategics that it's almost a dream of those in DVT thrombectomy, thrombolysis, or venous stenting. Really an amazing list. And you haven't seen that, I think, since peripheral vascular really took off. So where I'm concerned about venture, A, the strong venture firms will still survive and be there.
mm-hmm.
B, I think they'll still fund good investments. And C, the corporates will step up where venture is a little slower and more cautious. But this is an awesome field of corporates. And when you think those with stents and DVT thrombectomy, it includes almost everybody.
Yeah. So I mean that's great perspective. And you alluded to partnering, you alluded to, great ideas. You're sitting, I believe, in the lab. You were telling me a little bit earlier before we got started in the lab for Intervene. And I guess you've got a sterile room behind you right there in the in the camera. So you have this potential new device that you're working on. If you're at liberty to speak about it,
Yeah.
please let us know.
Yeah. So the pivot, and in terms of startups, pivot, restart, recapitalization,
Mm-hmm.
we've converted from DVR and the autologous valve to now chronic obstruction. And our objective is to go after the more organized syndicate, trabeculae, scarring, webbing of native veins, as well as ISR. Mm-hmm. And the ISR would be the gradual slow buildup that we see often, for example, in the NIVL patients, non-thrombotic patients, as well as the acute thrombosis that was not quickly addressed and is now chronic and a full occlusion. Mm-hmm. And this again goes all the way back to watching the Venety and everybody grow up, obviously Medtronic and Cook, and now all the way to Gore, Becton Dickinson, et cetera. The post-thrombotic patency rates needed improvement. And the thought was, if we could debulk could we improve those patency rates? Um, and same on an ISR, could we clean that out without the need for always having to reline? And I think sort of my aha happened Charing Cross last year, watching a presentation by Mr. Black, where a athletic young patient had to be relined 3 times. And there was a realization that that excess metal was not a viable alternative for a chronic condition where these patients often have very long life expectancies. And at that point, the thought was, you can't do any worse. For example, just relining and high pressure PTA where we can't debulk. We know that outcome. We know that patient has a pretty high probability of reinterventions forever. So the thought being, could we improve on that? And then secondarily, in the native veins, and I know this is a little bit of a pipe dream, but could we improve inflow? For example, popliteal inflow, even at the ostia? Could we, in fact, let's call it late DVT without regards to time of symptom onset? Could we help remove the wall adherent rind, if you will? So there's a lot of different applications, but ISR seems to be a really, really good one with a very compelling need. And I will say, Inari and the RevCore have done very well. And the RevCore is the first tool to do something like that. I think it's just had an amazingly good initial run, legitimizing the unmet need. And ultimately, these patients seem to be benefiting in a situation where very often they had no options. So, yeah, I think from a number of reasons, the timing is good here. The knowledge of sort of limitations of our post-thrombotic venous stenting in the deep stenting world, and this issue of awareness of long life expectancies in some of the younger patients that we treat. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a moon and the stars lining up well. And yeah, if you can be a fast follower to Inari, that's not a bad place as a startup.
Well, that's a lot of interesting perspective. And you clearly have a grasp of the topic. I even I feel like I learn every time I speak to you. And I agree, it probably is a significant unmet need to clear out significant in-stent restenosis, particularly in patients who are non-thrombotic, whom you really don't want to be dealing with these issues post-procedure, and these younger and healthier individuals in whom you want to maintain a certain quality of life. So I wish you all the success with bringing this to fruition, because I've had experience with every device that you're referring to, and there's certainly continues to remain an unmet need, and certainly the tools can be refined and improved over time. Any sort of last last thoughts or general advice on crystal ball on what you think is sort of coming next?
It's interesting. I do think we'll move to the chest, and that has everything to do from central venous lines to you name it. I would, latest, and I think a JVIR article was just showing stenting at the profunda, when that is all that is there for inflow. So I think there's potentially work to improve inflow as well. Whether it works or not, time will tell. But yeah, I actually think there's a few more things on the horizon relative to this lifelong awareness, if you will, and let's call it stent maintenance. So I think there may be entirely new tools to deal with chronic as well, because acute seems very well served, but this no man's land in the middle, that when the grummus is very difficult to deal with, and then of course, fully organized and fully, you can't call it thrombus. I think there's going to be something to deal with that lifelong problem,
Right.
and the issue of reintervention. And I will say, you mentioned non-thrombotics, that slow gradual buildup. It's pretty surprising because stents have a very good, 1 year to 3 year patency at, non-thrombotic patency. And yet that slow buildup, we're now starting to see those patients with luminal restrictions. And once they become symptomatic, all of a sudden, yeah. So it's under 8%, but it's such a big number that this 5 to 8% of that number is very large. And at the same time, I don't think we're ever going to get our patients, our DVT patients and our acute thrombosis patients are not going to be treated like a stroke team or a PE, like the PERT effort, or 90-minute door to balloon PCI. This is something that symptoms and muscle cramps are still going to be, they're not going to go to the doctor, they're not going to get results quickly, and so therefore this is going to be a generational issue. So I'm just encouraged. I think Venus is very, very ripe and a lot of white open space. Yeah, it's a very lucky time to be involved, I think.
Well, thank you for those, last minute thoughts and advice and wisdom, frankly. And thank you for joining us today, Jeff.
Oh, no problem. And you have all been very good to work with. I think of the difficult patients that you've treated, we've got to watch. Part of this view is simply because what you treated, whether it's in the clinical trials, but that was a huge awareness of not cherry-picked patients, and that real world look was just super helpful.
Sure, sure. Thanks again.